Hey, good morning, all. Welcome to the Common Good Podcast. It's a Thursday, and we call this May 13th if you follow the Julian calendar. So good to see all of you today. Our Common Good Thursdays are spent thinking about issues that matter to us. And the issue we're going to be talking about today is it possible to heal the divides that exist in our society, in our culture, even between us? What do we do about the divides that exist? So glad to have Vanessa Ryerse on today because Vanessa contributed to a book by that very same title, How to Heal Our Divides. It's one of those books that has chapters and essays from people, from various people. And Vanessa's chapter is rooted in something that she shared on the Vote Common Good tour this fall. And she was one of our touring speakers. And so really excited to talk about this whole notion. First of all, what's in her particular essay, the story that she told, but then this larger question of how to heal our divides in our society. And I don't say that, sort of facetiously asking the question, is it possible? I think there's a lot of metaphors we can use, and healing a divide is one of those. Bridging a divide is another one. Crossing a divide. Like there's all kinds of ways. And even if the question of a divide is the right way to think about what's going on in our culture and our society, are we divided or are we disagreeing? Is disagreement good? So there's a lot of things to talk about when it comes to this question of where we find ourselves in our culture and our society. Now, we like to talk about these issues on Thursdays. On Fridays, we talk about science. On Mondays, we do roundups of the news. Tuesdays is politics. Wednesdays are faith days, because we're trying to extend an entire conversation about what it means to be people who live in the world in a way that brings about the goodness. So we'd like for you to be common good people, and we want you to feel like you have a community of people that you can join when you're doing so. So Vanessa, congratulations on your chapter in the book. I think your chapter is the best in the book. So if people were going to, Dan, our producer, Dan, is fond of saying, most books are entirely too long, and a lot of us have felt that way, that especially nonfiction books, you feel like, about half of the chapters were really great. The other half could have done without. But you feel like the book is still worth it. And if someone were to pick up the book, Heal Our Divides, they would find your chapter worth the price of purchase all on its own. All right. So Vanessa, give us a little background where you are. We like to ask people who are in the watching on the live streams, tell us where they are. So if you're watching from anywhere in the world on video stream, on YouTube, Twitch, Facebook, we'd love to have it on Instagram, but they don't play nice with other children in the video streaming worlds. So let us know where you're coming from. But Vanessa, you are in Arkansas, and tell us a little bit about your life, and then tell us a bit about this chapter that you wrote for the book.
Okay, so I am in Northwest Arkansas. We've been here for about 15 years, and my husband Rob, who is often on the podcast, and I am in his office right now. We planted a church called Vintage Fellowship, and we had grown up in fundamentalism, really traditional churches. We did that for 10 years. We started our first church the week after we got married, and we did that without a break for all that time. And we turned 30 and decided we really needed to start a church that we would go to, even if they couldn't pay us, which is good because it's still really hard to pay us.
Well, and I will just say that little notion, for people who don't know, that little notion that people who start churches have to make a deliberate decision to make a church that they want to go to, as opposed to churches that other people would like to go to. That is a really big question that we would have maybe we'll do it in this conversation. But we can certainly have an entire hour-long conversation about just that notion if we wanted to, about what does it mean to start something that fits you, or to start something that fits someone else. This is true across industries, and certainly true in the church world. So that's kind of a big deal.
Yeah. So we have been, Vintage has existed for 15 years, which is pretty amazing for a church start. They fail like restaurants. And so the fact that we're still here and kicking, especially after this past year, is really amazing. And it's a space where I was able to make some really big moves, because having grown up in fundamentalism, women just have no place in any kind of leadership And it's such an identity issue. And so after being in this like safe space where I could really explore and ask a lot of questions, and I could, step up front and speak, it became obvious to me that all my life I had been called to be a pastor, and I had not been allowed to do that. So my only on road, was Bible college, marry a pastor, and then you get to be a pastor's wife, and then you get to have like a little tiny segment of leadership, as long as you're not up front, not behind the pulpit, not on Sunday morning, maybe on Mother's Day, whatever. And so Vintage became a place where we all were exploring like where the limits were. And I realized that Vintage was really comfortable with women as leaders, and I had to grow into that space. So about 5 years ago, they ordained me, which was an amazing process and a great thing for both of us, for the church and for me. And so, we're not part of a denomination, but it was a question of like kind of affirming the fact that I belong as a leader. And so I just kind of gotten started with all of that when the whole Trump presidency happened.
Yeah, visited us like yes, for some like a dark
spilled
nightmare.
out on the floor. Yeah, and so that
And
kind
to
of
say
changed
that
it.
you were in the religious stream that's referred to as fundamentalism was a positive term in the world you were from, like being a fundamentalist in the world you were
Yeah,
in. That was the self-described term as a positive one,
right,
and that
right,
also came with a particular political view that
right.
that had you seated as a conservative, as a Republican, as both of those.
Oh
We've
yeah,
talked
I
a lot
didn't.
about that.
I don't think I even knew. Growing up, I don't think I even knew anybody who admitted to voting for a Democratic candidate. I mean, it was just so. It was just so connected. There wasn't anything
Mhm.
else. And I also, I mean, I grew up going to a private Christian school. So kindergarten through 12th grade, that was all my education. All of like everything pointed me into that world. Um, that was just very narrow. And it took me a really long time to realize like, oh, you could be a Christian, you could vote for a Democrat. I think I was here in Arkansas before I really understood that and could see that and understood that. So I mean, it's such a small, narrow uh, world. If you think, they have you for school all of that time in these really formative years, and then they, shunt you into Bible college, and then you're into ministry, and so you never really get this chance to see that there's a whole other world out there.
Got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So
you were even as someone who was like you had a lot of things to be thinking about. You're starting a family. You're starting this church. You're figuring out your own role in the world as an adult. Like there's a lot going on.
mhm.
Politics for you was less front and center. What was it? I mean, were you thinking a lot about your political identity and how you were going to vote and all that, or
No, I mean, I voted Republican just reflexively. Um, a lot of local races, you do your civic duty, you're supposed to go and vote, like, but I didn't really know that much about the issues, and I didn't really pay real close attention. I would try to read up ahead of time. And of course, Rob, my husband, is really interested in politics, always was. You know, he grew up going to teenage Republican school. Like, I mean, he was, I mean, just very interested in politics all the time. So it was kind of his world. And so, I was interested in it the way I'm interested in football, like because he's interested in it. So I, kind of follow what he would say about things. And so, yeah, politics was not, it was not front and center for me at all. It was, you vote pro-life because that's according to your faith. And, that's as much as I really noticed or cared about. And I feel badly. I mean, I was really asleep during the Obama years. it didn't seem to me like there was all that much
Hmm.
going on. I remember watching the inauguration, and that was about all I remember. I mean, I was doing kids, I was starting my little side business, we were doing the church. I wasn't paying attention to any of that.
And I
So,
bring that up because the move that got you from that space and up to 2015 or maybe all the way up to 2016, there's a big shift because the next thing fast forward a couple of seasons in the life of Vanessa Ryerse, and you're traveling on a bus begging people to become politically active and politically engaged. So
yes.
that's a piece of this story, and I think it's a big piece of talking about healing these divides, because you felt something going on in you. Is that right?
Yes.
That was
Yes.
that felt divided. And I think
Yes.
this is a really important part of, if we're going to talk about healing divides, like so many issues in our society, that you get this fractal like experience, where that which is happening in the small situation is also happening in the larger situation, these matching patterns. And
Hmm.
so if you notice that there's a fracturing, a divide in our society, sometimes that it can be recognized by a fracturing or a divide inside oneself. And I think that's the
Hmm.
most helpful way for someone to think about these things. So we'll get into that, but I think it's also worth you noting, you're an artist, and you
Yeah.
referred to it as a side business, but you took your artist mindset and passion and moved that into creating some art. And I think that's interesting because I've kind of noticed in you that you've dug not only in this new awakening of political engagement. I think you approach it as much as an artist as you approach it as a religious person reshaping a political identity, like that other part
Mm.
of your life that you knew well, that you've kind of come at this thing and you do this particular kind of art that I think is actually a wonderful imagery for what whatever this notion of healing our divides might actually be about. So can you say a little bit about that, and then we'll jump back onto the bus, the
Yeah.
proverbial and literal bus story.
Yeah. Yeah. So, my art, is I sort of stumbled into it. I had always been interested in selling antiques and old things. That I mean, since I was a little kid, I used my first babysitting money to buy antiques from garage sales. Um,
Really?
and yeah, yeah. So
What
that's
was
how
it?
I kind
What
of.
was it about antiques? Do you know even to this day
I
why
think
old stuff?
it's about connection. It's about, most people gravitate to antiques that they saw in like their grandma's house. It's a nostalgia factor. It's something that's comforting and familiar.
Hmm.
And so it's this kind of reorienting experience of interacting with something that's been around for a really long time.
Hmm.
And so, just it's got a smell, it's got a feel, it takes you back. And so, I mean, yeah, that's how I got started.
Yeah.
It was I just had always been around old things, and yeah, it's we joke because Rav is like this really progressive, like out in front, loves new technology, loves everything that's shiny and new, and I love everything that's old. So I'm always looking at what do we have that's old that we can remake and redo. So that's kind of the mindset I bring to everything. So I was selling antiques. I'd come across these things that were broken, but they were really old and they still had like a history and a value. And that just it felt wrong to me just to be throwing things away. And especially when eBay first got started, people only wanted things that were perfect. And so, they were getting the best bids, but then there were these really interesting, just old things. And so that was about the time that Etsy started, and that was like the hipster thing, the handmade, the craft, all of that kind of world, that scene, that mindset. And so it kind of gave me a really great platform to start being creative with these old things that I had found. And so I work primarily with broken dishes. I was when I first got started, I was just exploring everything. Anything that was old, I would try to remake. In fact, I mean, the picture behind me was uh, it's a print that hung in Rob's grandfather's office, and it got scratched up, and it just sort of bugged him, and so I remade it. And it's you can't see it very well, but it's got the lyrics of a U2 song
Huh.
written over it. I distressed it and I cut a hole in it, made a window. I don't know if we can see. There we go, the window
Yeah. Yeah.
going backwards. So it's just it's taking these old things and repositioning them and thinking about them in a different way, or just tweaking them so that they work for where we are now. So then I really settled into the medium of broken china mosaics. And so that's a,
Okay.
using
Is that a
dishes.
medium people are aware of, the broken china dishes medium? That's
Yeah, some people
fantastic.
are. I mean, I can understand if that's not like, you're not familiar with it, but pretty much anybody who knows me in this area, if they break a dish, they bring it to me. They don't throw it away. They bring it to me. And I think it's, as a medium, it's really fascinating because everybody has dishes, everybody has to eat. It's a communal experience. You have memories attached to dishes. These are your grandma's dishes. You had family celebrations, whatever. And so there's a universality to it. There's also a really strong like feminine to it, because usually
Hmm.
it's pretty, they're dishes, they're sweet, whatever, but they're also really tough. Um, so it's an interesting thing to work with. And so then you're taking then I started to be able to control like the pieces I would get when I could cut it. I don't just smash it. Everybody thinks, oh, you just drop it on the floor, or hit it with a hammer. There's a craft to it. So I started doing that, and I did that for several years. And then I got a chance to do a really large installation for a hotel in Washington, D.C., the Conrad Hilton. And so that is a 25-foot by 7-foot mosaic made entirely of blue and white dishes. Um, and they named the room after it. It's the Blue Willow Room. So
And I
I
have
think
seen
it's,
it. It is
you've seen it.
stunning. It's
Yeah.
unbelievable that you take these broken pieces and of I should say you take these pieces of china cut, and because it is more exacting than just a bunch of shattered little pieces put together at some kids park board art craft thing.
That's
It's
how you get started, though.
there there's a pattern to it that is recognizable by experience, but you can't see or name the pattern. Like there's something about it that I think is really curious, and that's what I mean by saying that artist mind is, I think, what you bring to this conversation. A lot of us are in this, from the religious side or the political side or the social engagement or justice sides, all of which are important. But then there's this artist's mind, this artist's spirit, this artist's sensibility, and that taking these because one version of conservatism is to keep what was great from the past, and one version of describing progressivism is
Mhm.
to be sure we grab a hold of what's going to be useful and beneficial from the present and the future.
Mhm.
That's a different way, and you sort of embody that by creating this old thing in these old pieces in this new way for this current purpose. Th- that's a whole way of thinking about healing divides. I know that's not what your chapter's about. Your chapter's more about your own personal story, but I
Mhm.
think this larger question of how we heal our divides can be seen in your art as much as in the the personal experience you write about in the book.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you are picking up on something, because I, I think if we're gonna heal, we can't just throw everything away and start from scratch. It's overwhelming and it's displacing. And so you're right. There is this mindset that like we really there are things that we can pull out of, you know, the the mess, that we can work with and use
Mhm.
it to reclaim this and make it strong, make it beautiful. So
Okay, so can we
yeah,
just
you're
can we so that people know that about you, that's how you've approached the world. Let's jump back into the story. So something happens in 2015, 16, and you start to awaken to a crisis in your own self. You start finding a bunch of cut and broken pieces. To just belabor
yeah.
this metaphor, which I will probably do for the
Yeah.
next 30 minutes. But
Yeah,
uh,
it's an easy one. It's an easy one.
yeah,
It's
right,
very
right.
relatable. So it's there's some universality to it. Yeah, I Rob got real involved with politics, and I kind of was satisfied with that for a while, but there was the shooting that happened in El Paso. Um, there's always moments that just become tipping points for people, and for me that was a tipping point. And I was no longer satisfied to just wait for my husband or somebody else to do something.
Mm.
It became very personal for me. So that shooting, the shooter we knew drove like 10 hours to go to El Paso, chose that city for a particular reason. It's right on the border. It's a border city, and it's a world where they don't think of it as us and them. People live together, even what no matter what side of that border they live on, they live together. They're intermingled, they're family, they belong to each other. And so for that shooter to go choose that Walmart and to specifically target brown people, we're told that he, just would save his ammunition and pass over, opportunities. It wasn't just shooting anybody. He specifically was after brown people. And um, so yeah, so our daughter, our third kid, is adopted, and she's Latina. And I just, it was that moment of realizing I couldn't protect her from the mindset
Mm.
that was just stirring at that point. And it was based in the discussion about immigration policy and the border wall, and you know people taking our jobs, blah, I mean, all of that nonsense. And to just was this focus of wanting to destroy, and it just I couldn't get away from, I couldn't get over it. It
Mm.
just kept bothering me. And so I went to a couple of meetings for the local Moms Demand Action group, and I just wasn't getting, I don't know. I just was haunted by it. And so that was about the time the border experience was. That, I think that was the first time you did that.
Yeah,
Can't
we've Oklahoma
remember.
Good. We led a group of leaders down to the border and had an
Hmm.
experience there at the Walmart
Yeah.
where these murders happened, and yeah, it was
Yeah.
quite moving.
Yeah. So that was my opportunity. When I heard about it, I just said, I'm going. I don't know why. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know why I have to, but I have to go to this. I have to be a part of this. I have to see this with my own eyes. And so while I was there, I had an experience, just kind of in the dark, you know, wrestling with God. Like I think you have to, and thinking like I can't do anything about this. This feels too big. I have no platform. I have no YouTube channel. I'm not anybody. Um, what can I possibly do? And I really heard God's voice say, "You haven't said anything yet. So you just have to start talking." And so that I came home from that trip and I started talking to the congregation, and I just kind of, I couldn't shut up,
Mm.
which
It
I,
opened the spigot. Yeah.
it did. And when you're brought up in fundamentalism, one of the things that they really beat out of you is your ability to trust or acknowledge your emotions,
Mm.
because
Hmm.
they're not trustworthy. You can't trust your feelings. And so it's really deeply conflicting to be angry and to feel like that's not nice, and to not know what to do with it. And so, getting familiar with anger and figuring out how to just kind of live with it and then
Yeah.
use
Right.
it. uh yeah, yeah,
So these
yeah.
divides that
So
exist in our society, they're exacerbated by our politics. Often, like politics has been
mhm.
used in the history of our country in uh, many circumstances to try to wedge people apart, to move voting power one way or the other. I mean, the upside to a democracy is that when people vote, the person who receives more votes then receives the power that comes with that elected office. Um, yeah, I mean, unless we're going to have a different experience going forward if Republicans get their way in some spaces and places. But most normally, this is how it's going to go. So people really want to use politics to get people to do something specifically to vote on their behalf, and so there's a lot of leveraging going on to move someone's action one way or the other, because there's a lot at stake, and that can start to create this sense of a divide, right? That you're on this side or on this side. And something about our societies like this, like, well, whose side are you on? Who do you root for? Whose side do you take in an argument? Which bachelorette, or I don't know these shows, but which bachelor or bachelorette do you think should go with the person, which is just still amazing to me. Um, right, but there's just something about the binaries that we recognize as human beings,
Yeah.
the this or that, gets played on. Uh, and sometimes that's all about the other, and sometimes we're starting to feel that in ourselves, where we feel like I have to make a choice. And that's what I've heard you say when you've told this story before, and you're saying it again today, it seems to me, is you felt like, okay, this is the good choice, and this is the positive side of that. I now have to decide to act, and to go, and to speak up, and to leave the space I was in and go to this new space.
Mhm.
So that in some ways that healing of that divide is something happening internally in you during that period. Did it feel that way to you, that you were reconciling with something that you had grown comfortable with, where life was, and now you were discomforted? Is that a way to say it?
Yeah, it absolutely was a case of being deepable, but keep I had to keep moving through it. And I think about on the bus one time you said to me, you're a long distance runner, and that you said, I don't make decisions on a hill.
Yeah.
And I feel like I spent the whole year on a hill, and I just had to keep going.
Right.
Um, and push through, because I knew that I couldn't stay where I was.
Mm.
I had seen too much. I understood how things were going, and I could not go back to what was familiar. And it was so hard. I mean, everybody can tell this story, but losing friends that are kind of fringy, and you're like, there's somebody from high school, and you're like, okay, that's all right. But then, like, it gets closer and closer and closer, and you're losing relationships. I've heard, I mean, thousands of stories of people that I lost my best friend. I lost,
Yeah.
my grandparents. I lost my parents.
Yes.
But we are divided because of this political situation. And so how are we going to move forward? You have to have a lot of internal
Mm.
unity if you're going to keep pushing through that level of discomfort.
Right.
And so, yeah, for me, it was deeply internal work, deeply internal. And so, I mean, even getting on the bus, like, it was really uncomfortable for me, because
Mm-hmm.
I had to leave the kids and leave my business, and Rob ran it, and I was doing something that felt so unfamiliar to me. I think in a lot of ways, like, the image in my head is sort of like I felt like a marionette in some ways, that, like, the bus gave me a chance to, like,
Interesting.
move in ways that I didn't know that I could. Oh, I didn't know I could do this. Like, okay. Um, but it also was so healing to be able to realize, oh, I have this agency. I can make this step forward. I can speak these words. I can be confident about this. It's worth the fight. And what I say is going to make a difference, because ultimately that's the thing, is we have to keep creating, have to keep modeling for people that, yes, you can move through this uncomfortable um, change of, identity and ideas, and come out the other side and feel whole.
Yeah.
We have to keep modeling that for people. So
A- and I think that's
that
such a
healing
helpful way to think. Such a helpful way to think about it, that we have to engage ourselves. Like, it'd been very easy for you to set those emotions aside, set those thoughts aside that got you into to be clear for people who don't know, you traveled on a bus for about 3 months all over the country, giving talks outside in the middle of the COVID pandemic, trying to ask people of faith to not support Donald Trump for very particular reasons that we will play the audio and video of the talk that you gave on that here in a minute. Um, and one of the arguments that's made in our society right now, and I think it's somewhat helpful, but I think it's a bit of a misnomer, is the problem now is not that we're disagreeing about politics. The problem is we can't even agree on what the facts are. I don't know if you've heard that, but
Yes.
that's a very common way to distill the moment we find ourselves. And we're going to show a video here from a TED Talk in a second. And I think while this video we're going to show on the TED Talk has nothing to do specifically with this particular question, but in fact it was recorded back in 2009. But it's another way to acknowledge these differences and this struggle that of the way that we view the world. And one of the things I think that happens to a lot of us who, whether you use wokeness as a positive notion, like I do, like, hey, it's time to wake up, or you use it as a derogatory term to say that some people are all woke, they're paying attention, is that you start to see other realities in the world. And sometimes that can be described as we can't even agree on the facts. And I think we should be a little more cautious about saying, well, the problem is that we don't have a shared set of facts, because that's not how human beings work. What we have is varied perspectives that are measuring different realities. And I think we have to be more careful to not just call that somehow we now have no basis on which to run a society, because we all have to have the same perspective in order to move forward. First of all, I don't think that's true. Secondly, we're never going to get that. Thirdly, that's not how we got to where we are now. That the problem isn't that we don't agree on the facts. The problem is we have very little capacity to understand another perspective, meaning another angle on it. So, Dan, if you're okay, and I know, Vanessa, you haven't seen this video. I saw this video a couple of days ago in another thing I was in, and I haven't stopped thinking about it. So I look forward to thinking about it together with you. So this is this little TED Talk. It's about a minute long or so. So if you're somebody that gets nervous about having to watch, how long is this going to go on? It's just a minute or so.
Imagine you're standing on a street anywhere in America, and a Japanese man comes up to you and says, excuse me, what is the name of this block? And you say, I'm sorry, well, this is Oak Street, that's Elm Street. This is 26th, that's 27th. He says, okay, but what is the name of that block? You say, well, blocks don't have names. Streets have names. Blocks are just the unnamed spaces in between streets. He leaves a little confused and disappointed. So now imagine you're standing on a street anywhere in Japan. You turn to a person next to you and say, excuse me, what is the name of this street? And they say, oh, well, that's block 17 and this is block 16. And you say, okay, but what is the name of this street? And they say, well, streets don't have names. Blocks have names. Just look at Google Maps here. There's block 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. All of these blocks have names, and the streets are just the unnamed spaces in between the blocks. And you say, okay, then how do you know your home address? I said, well, easy. This is District 8. There's block 17, house number 1. You say, okay, but walking around the neighborhood, I noticed that the house numbers don't go in order. He said, of course they do. They go in the order in which they were built. The first house ever built on a block is house number 1. The second house ever built is house number 2. Third is house number 3. It's easy. It's obvious. So I love that sometimes we need to go to the opposite side of the world to realize assumptions we didn't even know we had, and realize that the opposite of them may also be true.
Isn't that something? I know you're watching this on your phone, Vanessa, but if you can see that, this idea that where I live in the United States, we do name our streets and not our blocks. And then think that in Japan, they don't name the street, they name the block. And we refer to the block as the unnamed space in between the streets. And in Japan, they call the street the unnamed space in between the blocks. That's what I think is going on, right? So when you talk about healing the divide, the question is, the divide is that unnamed space between us, the thing we can't figure out, right? You're on this side, I'm on this side, here we find. And because it's the unnamed space in between, I'm naming the block, you're naming the street, and we're just like, no, the thing you're naming is not a thing to me, and the thing that I'm naming, you act
Yes.
like you don't even understand what I'm talking about. This is what I
Yes.
think happens internally to us, and I think this is what happens in our culture and society. So I don't think it's as simple as, well, these people have one set of facts and I just have another set of facts. It's
Yeah.
there's something else going on. I'll just say, like in Minnesota, where in Minneapolis, where I live, there's we renamed a lake back to the indigenous people's name of the lake, Ska, and it had been named Lake Calhoun after a senator with a very terrible reputation for the who treated the indigenous people. So a number of years ago, they renamed the lake and then had to rename the street around it. So it was the parkway that went around it that was called Calhoun Parkway is now called Ska Parkway. The fight that went into naming the street, that's one kind of argument. What do we call the street? Very important argument. It's
Mhm.
but that's playing in one set of that's playing inside of a set of shared presumptions, right? That there's a street, it has to have a name. Now, what's the name going to be? This idea raised in that video is a little different. It's saying we're now talking about two different realities that are both legitimate realities. And this is where I think, whether it happens internally to us, happens in a relationship disagreement, happens in a culture and a society, that's approached differently than arguing about the name of the street and should we rename the street. So do you have thoughts
Mhm.
about that? I know this struck you first here. You know, you haven't had a chance you haven't been ruminating on it for 2.5 days like I have, but do you have any thoughts or reactions to that notion as it relates to where we find ourselves and how our political spaces are being strained? And
Well, the thing that struck me is that we need people that we need a government that represents both spaces,
yeah,
the block and the streets. And the United States government was not set up that way. It was not set up to represent women, immigrants, like people that didn't own land. It wasn't set up originally like
hmm
that. So, um, one of the journeys that you go on when you're thinking about voting for the common good is to start listening to how things affect other people, and and that's one of the ways that you heal the divide is you start being concerned, or at least listening to why the other person is concerned about an issue.
yeah,
um, and so I think about some of the conservative voters that, from where I came from, and the conflicts that we experience. you know I'm suggesting this super foreign idea to them, like, okay, so my first grade teacher, like, I think I had some post, and my first grade teacher just jumped all over it, like, how could you babies? For her concerns are really about being a good person,
mm, yeah,
and being a good, like, and so I just find myself thinking, like, one of the ways that we can heal is by showing people that you can be a good person,
right.
like, by listening to somebody else's situation, and that is soul expanding for you, and the world gets bigger and brighter and more interesting when you can concern yourself with not just your own stuff but somebody else's experience.
Yeah, and that is so well said. And though, when if you push this metaphor of naming the streets or naming the blocks, people are still traveling on the street. It's just, is the street the thing that you're talking about to reference yourself, or are you referencing yourself by the block about where
Mm.
you find, or other peoples will identify themselves. If you're a child and you haven't yet created a map in your brain or have spatial categories, you might say, well, no, I live at the house on the top of the hill by the big tree. It's around the corner from the rock. It's up from the park, right? So now you're going to reference yourself in these other ways. And this is the human experience itself is what I think we have to utilize as the way to cross divides, if we want to use divides language, or to understand one another, or to move ourselves forward. And the degree to which we can uh, have a commonality on the reference points, like to you say,
Mhm.
when this person's wrote to
Mhm.
you and said, how can you do this, what about the babies? You're like, I wasn't even talking about the babies. And she's like, well, that's the problem. These are the unnamed things that you're not caring about, right? To realize, okay, you've referenced yourself to that, I'm referencing myself to something, to another
Mhm.
place. How then do we engage? And so a big piece of it seems to me, and what you do so well in your own talk, is self-understanding. If one comes to grips with themselves, uh, then they recognize, oh yeah, here's where I'm framed, here's where I find myself, and now we're going to now we're going to need to move forward. Th-
Mhm.
so that's my dreamy bit about all this. I really do believe one of the problems, though, that we struggle with is we're not honest as human beings to the degree that we would wish we were. We're not honest with ourselves. Human beings are the only animals, I think, on the planet that self-harm and probably operate in self-delusion. Like, we lie to ourselves and then we harm
Yeah.
ourselves. It's just something else that's going on. And not only are we not always honest with ourselves, we're not honest with others, because we think the outcome of being direct or honest or forthcoming is that someone else will get the power, right? And then what's going to happen? And this happens sort of around the world. Um, so that's this big struggle, it seems to me, if we're going to talk about the issue of, like, what do we do, how do we come together, how do we engage? Well, it's something more than just driving toward consent to the facts that I'm demanding that you hold to, and then from there we will
Mhm.
then make a decision and move forward. Like, who does that? That's where this artist side and this human experience side that you've been describing seems so important, and its function in our world and its function in ourselves. And that's, for me, why this Christian spirituality is so helpful in this arena, because Christian spirituality seems to me calls us to do that all the time, right? It wants us to,
Right.
uses these metaphors of seeing and not seeing, and that's not only something that goes on with our eyes, but it's really something that goes on with our brain. I'm just going to editorialize for one more minute. I was doing a bunch of research on why and how people see, because I wrote this book called Outdoing Jesus, and I wanted to say that the project of Jesus' teaching is that human beings should endeavor in the same work that Jesus was about, and even do greater works than these. And these miracles where Jesus allows people to see. And I think that human beings, we should also be in the business of helping people see. So I spent a lot of time around the people who work on what does it mean for a human being to see something. And you realize that seeing is not only an issue of your eyeball and your retina and your nerve. It's Seeing is actually a function of the categories that exist in your brain, right? So
Mhm.
we we have
Mhm.
categories that allow us to take in data, but that's not what's called seeing. So there's people for whom their eyes work, but their brain processing is where the problem lies. So there's people who have all kinds of damage to their eyeballs, and they can just fix that by giving them a different eyeball. But if there's a problem in the brain, so the seeing is really about your mind and about your brain, not just about your eyes. And that's where it feels like we are in our society, and all right, that was a long diatribe.
Well, you're talking about perception.
Yeah.
You're talking about perception, and you're right, that is totally different. Uh, yeah.
Well, and this is
Um,
this is where again, not to belabor your artwork, but when you take these cut pieces and you put them into a relationship with each other, you start to see the pieces and the space in between, and you've changed the perspective of a plate, we tend to think about a plate as a singular object with no spaces in between the plates. Right?
Yeah.
And not
A
much of a plate
cohesive,
if there's
yeah.
like, like there's gaps in between it. I don't know, we call that something else, but then you remake it into another experience.
Well, that's it's called adult. You see all of this, like when I'm making a mosaic and I have all these pieces and they're broken apart, and it's before I've grouted it, which is that stuff that goes in between the seams that creates a whole. So a lot of times what I'll do before that part goes together to make sure that it's right, I will stand above a mosaic and try to get far away enough from it, but I'll also squint over it because I don't want to see it clearly. I don't want to focus on the little details. I want to be able to focus on this, like how does the whole thing hit you? And so again, it's about seeing things in their relationship to one another differently. Seeing these pieces and seeing like if we're going to heal divides, we've got to be able to see. I don't know. We almost have to squint at it.
That
we got to
is
see it
such a
differently and not focus
fascinating
on those
notion,
details.
that you squint to take your eyes out of focus so you can see the whole better. That is that's a note. That is a notion right there, right? Like how do you see it clearly? By not see by squinting in a way that fuzzies up what's coming in so that you can be impacted by the whole and not be obsessing on the individual pieces or the specifics.
Right. I mean, I think that's part of it too, is that we have to become a little bit more skeptical about what we know for sure.
Yeah.
About everything. Yeah. So that's a
Yeah.
way of taking you away from something you rely on really easily and kind of throwing yourself off balance so that you can it differently.
At some point,
Yeah.
regular listeners
So.
will be tired of hearing this phrase, but Mark Twain has this great line where he says, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so." That idea, and that's what personal development, spiritual development growth is all about, is recognizing, there's unnamed things that I didn't even know were existing, and now I want to spend a little bit of time around that. So I feel like that's part of what the divides are, and the spiritual practice, the personal practice, the cultural practice of recognizing that people are naming a thing. And I'm not at all suggesting that what we need to do is say, there's some moral equivalency, or that every perspective, look, there are some things that you will absolutely disagree with that another person holds to be incredibly important. It's not about agreement. It's about recognition that there is a thing that's being described. And I think only then can you deal honestly with that thing, right? And say, well, let's talk about it and bring it up. That's partly why, a lot of the work that we want to do around this effort is to try to address that stuff that seems like people are just dodging over it. They're just passing it by, and like, hey, that thing we just passed by, let's talk about that for a second, because that might be where the power is. And you don't heal, bridge, cross, connect, any of that without getting a little bit uncomfortable and breaking the typical patterns that you've been in. Hey, can we do you have anything else to say about this, or do you want to I'd love to play people the video recording of one of the presentations that you did, because I think it's what's in the book. It's at least the basis of the content that's in the book, and I think it really says it well. So unless you have something else you want to comment on there, we could play that. And I don't know if you want to sit here and watch yourself. Okay, all right, you're good with it. All right,
yeah,
so here it is.
I haven't seen it in a while.
This is Vanessa. This was recorded. I think we were in Charlotte, North Carolina, maybe.
Pretty sure.
And
yeah.
all of our events,
the red doors
happen. Yes, standing up on the raised stair steps going into this church. And these are outdoor events. You'll hear all the outdoor sounds. We were doing the best that we could to hold events all over the country in the middle of a global pandemic in a socially safe way, and I think we accomplished that.
We did it.
And here's the
We did it.
here's Vanessa Ryerse.
I am a artist and a pastor and a wife and a mom. And I am pretty new to the tour, but along the way I've gotten a chance to take my son, who's here on the tour as well. I got to take him to the little Bible college where his grandparents met, where his parents met. Got to show him around that place where I had a lot of fun. And you know, it was one of those Bible colleges where you couldn't smoke and you couldn't drink and you couldn't dance and you couldn't go to movies and you couldn't play cards. And it seems crazy to say I had any fun, but I did. You got to understand where I came from. You see, my parents sent me to a little private Christian school from the time I was in kindergarten until I graduated. That was all the education I knew. They wanted to give us something better. They were trying their best, and they didn't know. They didn't know that that place was kind of a dark place. You see, when I was a little girl, the age of my own little girl, who's 6 years old, I was walking through the hallways of that school, and we were on our way to the drinking fountain, and I was curious, and I reached up and I touched that little crinkly edge around a bulletin board. And my teacher took me by the shoulder, marched me around the corner, put me in a dark room and closed the door and left me there. And it didn't get much better as time went on. There were rules all the time. New rules, new executive orders all the time. And you were being watched all the time. You were being measured when you walked in the door to see if you were holy enough, if you were good enough, if your skirt was long enough. So maybe you can understand why Bible college was a little more fun for me. I was actually there. I was there at that little Bible college 4 years ago, right around this time for our 20th class reunion. I was there with my husband and my oldest child, and we had gone and done that awkward conversation thing you do with the people that you went to college with. And then we went back to the hotel, and we were tired, and we turned on the news. And the news that night was the Access Hollywood tape. You remember the Access Hollywood tape. You remember how Trump bragged about what he could do, how he could reach out and grab a woman and do whatever he wanted to her body without her permission, that she didn't matter, she wasn't a person to him, she was just a thing that he could take and consume. And I remember thinking, based on all those places I had been and all those rules that they had had for me and my body and what I was allowed to do, that those people would make sure that he wasn't elected. And I thought, good, it's over. And you know that it wasn't. And so that day after the election, my friends all came to my house and we felt like it was a funeral. And we all started to get involved. And I didn't know what to do because I was raised Republican. That was my team. That we had a deal, right? I was supposed to be a good girl and they were supposed to protect me. That was the way that it was supposed to work, and my team betrayed me. But I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where I belonged. So about a year ago, August 3rd, I remember the day very clearly. All my kids were home, all four. My 2 college kids who, were home, and then my high schooler, and then my little bitty 6-year-old. We decided to go out back to school shopping at Walmart, like you do. We live in Arkansas. We packed up the little mom minivan, that ugly, ugly thing. Held up my phone. Come on, everybody, lean in. Let's take a picture. Do we have to? Yes, come on. So I snapped that photo and I brought it down, and I was going to post it on Instagram, and instead I saw breaking news. There had been another shooting. Another shooting. This one was in El Paso. As the news about that shooting, as the details became clear, I was haunted by those details. I could not stop thinking about it. I could not get it out of my head. You see, first we heard that the shooter, to honor his dark Lord and Savior, Donald Trump, had laid out his guns to spell Trump's name, to impress him. And then we heard from eyewitnesses that as that shooter went through the store, pointing his gun, that he would save his bullets, pass over the white people, and save his ammunition for brown bodies. And that's what broke me. Because my third child, my Charlie, my beautiful Latina, is adopted. She has straight black hair and big chocolate brown eyes, and she sings like an angel, and she's the glue that holds our family together. She's everybody's favorite person. And to think that if we had been in El Paso shopping at Walmart instead of in Arkansas shopping at Walmart, that shooter would have passed over me and the other kids and would have chosen to shoot Charlie, the best person I know. And I could not understand what had happened to my country. And I was so frustrated and angry and confused that I got on a plane and I flew to El Paso because I needed to see what was happening there with my own eyes. And I went there and I saw that long memorial. It goes on the length of a football field of people's grief and their remembrances and the people that were still gathering there to weep. And I saw the border wall, that hideous, ugly, rusty structure. In New York City, where my son goes to college, they have Lady Liberty, but on that border we have this nasty looking wall. What is that? And then we went to a detention center where Homeland Security is protecting us by separating little children from their mummies and daddies. Where I said to God, nobody's going to listen to me. Nobody's going to listen to me. What can I do? Nobody's going to listen to me. And you know what God said to me? You haven't said anything yet. See, I began to realize I know what it feels like to be a little kid in a dark place with nobody to protect you. I know what that feels like. And I need to put myself on the line for my brown daughter. I need to put my body on the line for her. Because that school where I went, that school, we talk about Donald Trump being a monster, but that school had a monster too. You see, his place was right at the bottom of the stairs in a corner where you walk down the stairs and come around to your classroom and nobody could see it. And that monster preyed on the little girls that would pass by. He took whatever he wanted without their permission. He didn't respect their personhood. He could do whatever he wanted. He could move on them. He could touch or grab whatever he wanted. And the news came out. And those men that ran that school, those good religious voters, when they found out, they gave him a love offering and they sent him on his way. I know that evil exists. I know that evil exists. But there's a special kind of evil when you know that something is happening and you don't do something. You see, back then, we needed a pastor, we needed a priest, we needed a protector. And now we need a president. We need a peacemaker. We're in a pandemic, and we have this piece of work. So I am asking religious voters, please do not give this man the love offering of your vote. I want kids to be safe. I want my kids to be safe. I want other kids to be safe. I want it to be safe for babies to be born. You can't make it safe for babies when you make it more unsafe for women. I am a mother. I am a spiritual mother. I'm an adoptive mother. I'm a biological mother. And I am asking, vote like a mother.
You know, it has been 6 months since I heard that. Probably 6 months since you've said it. Unless you had to say it again for some other reason. It's so good. Yeah, just really a great mosaic in its own right.
Thank you.
How does it strike you?
Thank you. I think I'm still weaving and putting the issues together and seeing them in contrast and connection. My way of communicating has to do with weaving and connecting ideas. And in that talk, you know, I finally am able to make the connection of what happened in my own upbringing with what I don't want to happen to my kids.
Yeah.
I'm able to find that motivation to prevent it. And that is still driving me. I still feel that drive, and it's still so needed. I mean, we're looking at how many news stories in the last couple of weeks with you know, sexual abuse and in churches and what's happening with women. And you know, Josh Duggar here in our same town, you know, we live in the same town as the Duggar family, and those headlines, the protection of the vulnerable, I mean, all of those things are still really driving me. They're still super important to me. So.
Well, I think your story there, your conversation today, your contribution to this book is what, you know, people will benefit from so greatly as they consider, you know, what do we do about the condition that we find ourselves in personally, in our families, in our communities, in our country. And it's just really great. So good to see you again, friend, and to talk with you.
Thank you.
Sorry we chewed up an entire hour together already. So, but we're glad all these folks were along. Thanks for all of you who were contributing on the chats and all the other places. Thanks for being a part of this. We will see you soon. If you found yourself saying, "Hey, Vanessa got to go down to the border. I would love to go to the border." Well, this same group that went with her down to the border is going to be going again September 20th or September 10th to November 14th. We're going to be along that same border wall from September 10th to October 17th as we ride bicycles from San Diego to St. Augustine, Florida. After we finish on the border wall, we'll then make our way until November 14th along the coast, where we'll talk about the stories of refugees and asylum seekers. We'll spend the first month and a half talking about the border and what that experience has been like, calling for a common good, border practices and immigration practices in this country. So we're doing it on bike rides from, you know, across the country, and we are going to be hosting community bike rides across the country, meaning all around the country. We'll invite people to host their own community bike rides to raise awareness of immigration and migration and refugees and asylum seekers. And we will invite you to do that. So you can head over to votecommongood.com and find a link to it there, or you can go straight to wethepeopleride.org. And you can sign up to host a community ride. You can pick a day or two or a week or a month or 65 days to come with us on the cross-country bike ride. You can find all kinds of ways to be engaged. So we'd love for you to do that. As Vanessa will, I think, attest, you can have a very life-changing experience by getting into those unnamed spaces that we call the borderland. The space in between is really magical. And so we invite you to come along with us. So Vanessa, thank you so much. Thanks for all of you that have been part
My
of
pleasure.
our day today. And we will talk to you all tomorrow.